Welcome back once again, everyone. This is part 3 of our Chapter 19 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled The War at Home. The focus question for this section is, how did the United States mobilize resources and public opinion for the war effort? During World War I, the federal government drastically expanded its role in economic affairs, particularly in the production of war materials and resources, even temporarily taking over whole industries on behalf of the war effort. Of course, business leaders generally acquiesced to the requests of the federal government to impose itself on their production processes, basically for reasons of patriotism and to support the government and America in general during these unprecedented times. This expansion of the state, however, was a golden opportunity for progressives to help reform American society, along with disseminating progressive values around the globe. And in general, almost all progressives rallied to Wilson's support and in support of the war effort. In ways very similar to the situation and the expansion of government powers in the Union during the Civil War, and to a lesser extent in the Confederacy as well, World War I created a temporary national state with unprecedented powers and a sharply increased presence in Americans' everyday lives. Such things included the Selective Service Act, which instituted the draft, which was only the second time in American history that a military draft had been put into place, the first time, of course, being during the Civil War. The government also established a War Industries Board, which was a regulatory commission that oversaw all aspects of wartime production. There was also the establishment of a War Labor Board. Progressives in government certainly had their day as well, as we discussed in the previous slide, and the War Labor Board helped push a progressive agenda of labor reforms, particularly around the minimum wage laws and minimum hour laws. These agencies in general, however, saw themselves more as partners of business as much as regulators, even though their powers were unprecedented in their levels of intrusion onto private enterprise. Corporate and individual income taxes in this period rose enormously to pay for the war, and surprisingly there was little pushback on this, as again patriotic fervor and American general support for the government and the war effort lessened any sort of dissent over an increase in taxes to pay for those efforts. However, just like in the aftermath of the Civil War, this expanded wartime state quickly withered away with the return of peace after 1919. But it did set new precedents for the expansion of government powers during such national emergencies, which would reemerge in World War II. And in the aftermath of that, those powers and the expansion of the government did not wither away at the same levels or the same rates that they had after the Civil War or after World War I. The war saw the American government engage in a massive propaganda campaign to drum up and to maintain support for the American war effort among the public. The Wilson administration created the Committee on Public Information, the CPI, to promote the war to Americans and the world in general. And the CPI used every available medium to flood the country with pro-war propaganda. And they used the language of social cooperation and expanded democracy with such rhetoric as the great cause of freedom. And this helped to make the word freedom take on a new significance, particularly as it related to ideas of self-determination, which was one of Wilson's 14 points. And the basic concept behind self-determination was that every ethnic group and nationality had the basic right to determine for for itself how it would be governed and who it would be governed by, basically stating that outside powers did not have the authority to impose itself on nationalities or ethnic groups. Now, the antithesis of freedom was portrayed as the German nation and people, who were cast as these barbarous brutes who aggressively attacked the civilized world, which was kind of ironic considering that up to that point, and particularly throughout the 19th century, German civilization and German science and German intellectuals were seen as the very pinnacle of Western civilization itself. Even though at the beginning of the conflict, the war threatened the unity of the suffrage movement, as some women supported the war effort and others were staunch pacifists, by and large, the domestic situation in the United States during World War I helped to speed up the process of the fight for women's suffrage, ultimately leading to the 19th Amendment. The National Women's Party was formed and led by Alice Paul, used militant tactics that older suffragists found scandalous in order to secure the vote, and this includes such things as civil disobedience like sit-ins and open public demonstrations, something that women's suffrage movement had generally shied away from prior to this. During this period, of course, many women entered the workforce, particularly in jobs typically held by men, since the majority of men were subject to the draft and substantial numbers of men did get drafted and sent over to Europe. Huge swaths of the economy and jobs that were typically held by men were now opened up, at least temporarily, to women. And a combination of women's patriotic service during the wartime in such industries and public demonstrations by National Women's Party suffragists ultimately led to full support for women's suffrage from the Wilson administration. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment, fully granting women the right of suffrage throughout the nation, was ratified. Besides women's suffrage, another policy that women activists had long advocated for that gained new ground and new traction during the Progressive era in general, but during the period of World War I in particular, was the prohibition of alcohol. Groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, organized massive petition campaigns in this period, and many more Americans than before came to see such reforms as a way to create a more orderly, disciplined, and responsible American population. Of course, World War I provided additional ammunition for the movement because many breweries were owned by German Americans. And ultimately, the petition campaigns proved successful with the passage of the 18th Amendment, which prohibited alcohol at the national level across the country. The World War I era helped to raise new questions about the nature of the relationship between government and the people. And one of the more significant questions at this time was, what exactly is the balance, or the correct balance, between security, especially security during wartime, and freedom? In general, the U.S. government erred on the side of caution, if you will, and the war inaugurated the most intense repression of civil liberties in the nation's history. Such repressions included the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The Espionage Act prohibited spying and interfering with the military draft. The Sedition Act made it a crime to speak out or publish anti-war sentiments, a gross infringement upon First Amendment rights. The most prominent victim of these acts was socialist and five-time presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs, who was jailed during World War I for his outspoken critique of the American war effort. Now, while in general patriotism certainly increased exponentially during this period, much of that can be termed what it can be known as coercive patriotism. State governments, and especially private groups, conducted even more extreme repression than the federal government. And particularly among private groups, they developed a new sense of what can be termed today sort of cancel culture, where those who spoke out against the war could face reprisals and exclusions from their social circles, and even firing by their employers due to their critique of the war effort. Patriotism came to be equated with support for the government, the war, and the American economic system, which of course ruled out socialism or communism from that equation. Most progressives in general, for fear of retaliation either from the government or their social circles or employers, failed to speak out against the broad suppression of freedom of expression. And with that, we conclude part 3 of our Chapter 19 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.